Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial here today, I'd like to share with you a way in which you can use a slab of gemstone with a drill hole, or even an extra large bead. It doesn't have to be faceted. I'm working with a basic oval shape and I'll show you some samples on the board in just a second. But what I want to share with you is this fancy frame. Now you can use this to set around regular cabochon settings, but I'm sharing today the way that you can use a drilled bead or a drilled slab, as it's super beginner friendly. Why don't we head down to the board and I'll show you some of the materials you'll need and talk about the tools. In terms of wire today, I'm going to be using 1mm or 18 gauge wire. I'm using soft raw copper. I'm also going to be using a small amount of 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. Both of these wires are round, they're both raw soft copper. Your basic toolkit will include round nose pliers. I'm going to use my trusty bent chain nose pliers. You can use any flat facing pliers with a reasonably tight tip just there. Whoops a daisy. I'm also going to be using my professional semi-flush cutters. Really useful piece of kit if you don't already have them. The key element that you may not have that makes this particular technique so much easier is a set of 2-step bail makers. Now I have made this design with the 6-step bail makers, just a lot easier. This is a 4mm pin and a 6mm pin, and they work really well. But as long as you've got two reasonably different pins on your 2-step bail makers, you're still going to get a variation of this frame. Let's just put those out of the way for now. In terms of the bead or the gemstone I'm using, I've gone to work today with some faceted slabs. Now these are all drilled, they've all got a really good drill hole. I think I'm going to make with the beautiful piece of sunstone, but you can obtain these in all sorts. I have them available on my Monday night lives in citrine, sunstone, charoite, and also I've got just a handful of mookaite left, so let's just pop those out of the way. I'm going to be making a basic frame for the slab or bead to sit inside. This is an optional extra, it's just something that I stuck on the top because I thought it was cute. You don't have to add that. I just wanted to show you an extra way that you can make use of these little coils that you'll find in the lots and lots of different people's wire work, but I often put a little coil up at the top, especially if I've slightly mangled the bail up here and I want a way to detract from the mess. I'll just pop a little coil on it, and then this is just a way that you can add a little bit extra. So I'll show you that at the end of the video, just as an option for any cabochon or bead pendant that you've created. The basis of today's technique is working out this frame wire. As I mentioned earlier, you can put this around the outside of a traditionally set cabochon if you prefer. So I'm going to be making with this a little bit later on today. And I've also, with this design, sometimes I like the slabs to be able to spin inside the frame, but on this one I prefer to have it set. So I've just popped a little bar across the back. You don't have to add that. That's a very simple technique, just with an open and closable loop on either end. The main part of today's quick tutorial for beginners is this lovely little bit of framing that you can add to any of your jewellery designs. So the first thing we're going to start with is creating a miniature little frame, or a simple little frame rather, that goes around the outside of your chosen bead or slab. This is for a drilled piece today, but you can apply any of my cab setting tutorials really to house a cabochon that is not drilled if you prefer. You'll still be able to add on that lovely frame. I've got this diminutive by comparison to some of the other pieces I have, slightly smaller. This is a 1-inch long piece that has a central drill hole running through the long length. It's faceted on both sides, so I might actually, if I'm going to keep this one, I'll probably make it able to spin, because of that sultry sparkle in the moonstone there. Sorry, it's sunstone. It's not moonstone. Same family, you know what I mean. So I have, for a 1-inch length cabochon or drilled slab. I'm working initially on this frame with a 12-inch length of that 1mm or 18 gauge wire. Again, this is soft raw copper. Now let's try and find something that's the right kind of size to bend the wire around. This is much too large, but it will give you an idea of the sort of things that you can just grab a hold of. I'm going to start by forming around something that is rounded, around the central part of that length of wire that we have, and you can see that it gives you a place to start. You don't have to have too many specialist tools, and all I'm going to do is just very gently, because we warmed that up, tighten it up slightly on both sides until I'm happy with how that looks. Now you can of course use a ring mandrel on something of this size, but if you don't have one of those that goes big enough for the slab that you're using, then just grab something from nearby that fits your size needs. So I'm then going to just straighten up those sides slightly. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time today on creating this surround. What I'm looking to do though is to have a piece that is larger than the bead or the slab that I'm using. So I just need to open that out ever so slightly before I start forming around the top of that bead or slab. So because I've warmed the wire, it's relatively easy for me to just freehand. Adding warmth to that wire really does help you in two ways. In the first action, it's making that wire a little bit more soft and fluid whilst you're forming it, and for the second part of the action that warming the wire helps you with, it makes it slightly harder in the long run. So once it's fully cooled down, you have a slightly harder piece of wire to work with. So in order for it to be easy for me, I'm just going to flip it over. And you do want to gap all the way around your chosen bead or drilled slab. And I like to have quite a reasonable amount of space to allow that slab to spin. What you'll often find with genuine gemstones that have been drilled is that the drill goes from one end and then it goes from the other end. And sometimes it doesn't exactly go halfway from side to side, from top to bottom. If you follow the logic, it's not always a straight line. So what you might end up with, if you make your frame exactly the size to fit, is that you'll set the drilled piece in position and then you won't be able to fully rotate the bead or the slab if that is your desire. So I tend to oversize these frames. It's more of a suggestion that it's there. So that's quite a lot larger than the piece in question. So what I'm going to do is just start refining that shape slightly and put some upright bends up at the top, which we will deal with in a little while. So let's just get that a little bit tighter, I think, at the top, like so. Before I start by putting some upright bends quite close to the centre, up at that 12 o'clock position when it's in its final orientation, and you can use this either portrait mode, landscape mode, or whatever funny angle you want to set it. As long as you've got enough space for your drilled slab or bead to fit inside the housing and spin merrily, job is a good one. So let's just straighten up and refine those angles up at the top. And I'm just going to push very gently with thumb and forefinger just to open that out slightly, and then we'll pop that down onto the board. So overall I'm quite happy with that. It might be a little bit tight. If you do need to nudge that over a little bit, I think it's a bit tight on this side, so flipping it over, because I'm right dominant, it makes my life easier. What I'm going to do is take those pliers quite close to that corner and just push very gently along until I slightly flatten that out. And what I can do is just gently move that position along ever so slightly, and you've got just a little bit more space instantly. You don't have to be too brutal with it. Once you're absolutely delighted with your frame and you're sure that's going to sit how you want it to, if you need it to spin, give it the space to spin. Once you're happy with that, you do have the opportunity to just give that a gentle hammer around the frame and the first very tiny amount up here, because we might want to do something fancy with that later. Haven't decided what kind of bail I want today, so try not to hammer too far up if you are going to hammer. Your other option for work hardening, if you're not confident with hammering or you simply don't have one, you can very gently open and close your pliers, flat facing pliers this is, all the way around that frame. Of course, at this stage you're applying extra hardening to the design and you will set that shape and size. Now I am marking the wire a little bit by opening and closing, and you would do with hammering as well, unless you've got a very fine touch or you use a couple of sheets of hardened perspex. Let's just pop that back in. Yep, overall I'm quite delighted with that. So for the next part of today's tutorial, we're going to work out how to do the fancy frame itself. As I mentioned earlier, you can use this in so very many ways. I have quite often created this and then just popped wire on either side and used it as an instant bangle. It doesn't take long to make up. So what we're going to learn how to do is to create this fancy frame. Looks a little bit like a Victorian mirror maybe. And the way to do this is to use your two-step bail making pliers. Now I'm going to draw the camera away so that you can see it from completely above, which is the best way to understand the technique. There is a teeny tiny bit of maths. So to create a length of 4 inches, you need around about 15 inches of wire, and that's utilising a 1mm or 18 gauge wire. The ratio might vary slightly dependent on what size bail makers you're using and what gauge of wire you're using. I'm using 1mm and 4 and 6mm bail makers. So with that in mind, if I take a look at the frame we've created and I measure that there are going to be 4 inches all the way round, then the ratio of wire I need will be a minimum of 15 inches. The exact ratio is about 3.5 to 1. 3.5 inches of straight wire to 1 inch of funny frame wire. I don't know how to describe it other than that. I came up with this many years ago and I absolutely love it. It's kind of rambling and rolling. Much like myself, I do tend to ramble. So as I say, the ratio is precisely 3.5 to 1 given the units that I'm using, given the wire that I'm using and the bail makers I'm using. What I would say is err on the side of caution and allow 4 inches of wire per 1 inch of frame that you want to cover. I know that's mathsy and nobody hates maths more than me. Let's get back down to the board and I'll show you how to create the fancy framework. So I have just over 14 inches here of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. Again, it is round, soft, raw copper. And my 14 or so inches of wire will create around about 4 inches of the final piece. So let's get down to business. What I'm going to do is just very, very quickly show you there's a 4mm side to my bail makers, there's a 6mm side to my bail makers. Making sure that the end of my wire is nice and flush cut and that I've already smoothed and warmed the wire through. I'm going to start by creating a loop on the end of that wire on the smaller side of those bail makers. So if I get that to scooch all the way around and then just allow that little bit to cross at the end point, trying to keep this in focal distance, and then we'll crop that in a little while. The next thing I'm going to do once I've created that loop is pop my bail makers back into position. So that pin needs to fit through the loop you've just created. And what I'm going to do is loop now in the opposite direction, like a figure of 8, around the larger pin of the bail makers. So looking at it, we're currently looking at it upside down. If I take the bail makers away, you can see I've got a small loop and around about 2/3 of a large loop. Now in the base of that large loop, furthest away from me right now, what I'm going to do is put the smaller pin of my bail makers. I'm then going to just rotate the tool around and make a small loop inside the base of the large loop we just created. And I'm going to continue turning that all the way around. If I remove the tool now, you'll see that I've gone around with the large loop, and then 2/3 of the way around the large loop, I've started turning it into a small loop. But then I've taken the wire all the way along, all the way around here, and then got it to continue along as if it was still that first piece of wire. What I'm going to do then is put my bail makers back into position, the small pin in the small hole we just created, or the small loop rather, turn it back up to the camera, and I'm going to create another 2/3 of a loop on the large side of those bail makers. Retracting the bail makers from the design, I'm going to put the small side of the bail makers back in, and I'm going to push the wire round this time, a little bit of both, rotate the whole thing. If I retract the tool, you'll see that I've got another, it's kind of a figure of 8, kind of a little snowman. And what we're looking to do is to create 2/3 of a large loop and then turn it into a small loop. And then we put the bail makers back into position, pop the large side. We're trying to keep it reasonably straight, but there's a little element of flexibility. We can straighten that up. Take the wire around to create 2/3 of a large loop. Retract the tool, like so. And then we put the small side in that gap. Now watch as the wire moves around. This is one of the reasons that I choose to move the piece of wire work rather than the actual tool itself sometimes. If I take this around, it's quite likely to hit things, but I wanted to show you a couple of different ways. So what I'm doing to make that move is just opening and closing very gently and moving that a small amount. So let's put the pin back in. You can make this up very, very quickly if you choose to. Put the pin back in the 2/3 of a large loop, draw that all the way around, bring that back into the centre of the camera. There we go. So you can see how that builds up. I'm just going to do that a couple more times and try and keep in the centre of the screen this time. Take the tail of wire all the way around. So we've got 2/3 of a large loop. Retract the tool. Put the small side of the bail makers in and then draw the wire all the way around. You will need to either retract the pin or move it around so that you can create the rest of that loop. Take the tool out of the way and you've created another segment. So just keep going, keep going, keep going. You can make absolutely yards of this stuff if you're bored or you're watching telly or you're sick and you can't go anywhere or you've got a slump in creativity. You can make yards of this because you can cut it to the length that you need. One of the reasons I say is to use the ratio of 4 inches to 1 inch, 4 inches of straight wire to 1 inch of this funny fancy framing, is because you can take small lengths of it and you can use it in different ways. So with this design, on several occasions, I've set small beads into the little apertures that are created along the way. You can add a line of wire either side and sew it all together to create bangles and rings. It's lots and lots of fun. So let's give that a nice smush to make sure it's nice and strong. Take the wire around one last time for the purposes of demonstration. So you've got that 2/3 of a large loop. Put the small side in, draw the wire all the way around, and again I will just move that to finish off that smaller of the two loops. So I've got around about 1.5 inches just here that you're looking at. So I will continue all the way along until I've got a good 4 inches of the wire, and we'll work out how to set that onto our frame in just a moment. So once you get going with that technique, it becomes second nature. It becomes much easier. The first couple of times it might just be taking a few extra seconds to get your mind in the game, but once you have got that sorted, it's really lovely. It's quite relaxing, a little bit mindful. So like I say, you can do yards and yards of the stuff and just store it until you need it. I've actually also used it to set across the face of a cab before now, just to act as a little bit of a bezel setting. So it's quite a useful technique to learn. I'll show you now on the board how to just get that refined so that it's perfect, and I'll also show you how to set it onto the frame itself. So we have our wiggly fancy frame, we have our frame itself, and we have the cab or the drilled slab that we're going to use. So let's move on to just refining this slightly to make sure it sits exactly how you want it to. Now if you turn it sideways, it can be a little bit bumpy up and down. What you can do to counteract that is take one circle underneath, one circle over the top, but that's a little bit complicated. So what I tend to do is just give it a little bit of a straighten and a flatten just by hand. I don't tend to use tools for this, and it's just a case of putting the intention of warmth from your fingers into the design. Once you've got that a little bit flatter and smoother, you can see it's a little bit raised just there, so just a quick twist sorts that out. What you can do is just give that a little bit of a straighten in much the same way. So this segment here is a little bit lower, so all I would do is just very, very gently rotate on those coils until you get that nice and straight. So it pays to have a board with a straight edge, and you can see if there's anywhere that needs a little bit of attention. I try not to straighten it too much because I now want to abuse the flexibility of this design to wrap it around the edge of the frame I've created. Now I've set in portrait mode, but I use this all the time in landscape mode. I use it for fancy cabs. You can set them however you want to. The balance will be interesting. You will need to apply a little bit more science as well if you're setting something on the diagonal as to where you have your 12 o'clock positions. You will want it with the central mass of your bead or your slab in mind. So that's one of the reasons I tend to go for portrait or landscape. Keep things simple. Maths, as I say, is not my friend. So what I'm going to do is estimate where the centre of my section, and this is around about 4 inches. From that, it was about 14 inches in the end that I used. So the ratio is about 3.5 to 1, give or take a little bit. But like I say, please allow 4 times as much straight wire as you want for this finished section. So I'm just starting down in the centre to get a little bit of a gentle curve, and I'm making very small movements around that central area, like so, just to make sure that we have enough of a curve in that wire. Now, as you'll notice from my demonstration piece, I didn't take the frame up to the shoulders, and I don't think I will on this one. So if you are going to very carefully measure all the way around and you apply that 4 times ratio logic, you will have enough wire. I simply didn't measure it. So there we go. I estimated and I fell short a little bit, but I don't mind that. I don't mind the shoulders being a little bit naked, so to speak. So I'm going to keep messing with that until it sits around the outside of my frame, and ideally I want those to be equal and opposite to each other at the top there, because even though I've got the gap, I do crave a little bit of symmetry to the eye. Although you've got a single loop on this side and it's moving in the opposite direction on the other side, I'm not fussed by that. I just want the 2 top sections to be equal to one another. So once I've created the curvature in the fancy framing section, we're going to add in our next segment of wire, and I have a scrap of around about 10 inches here. This is 0.4mm or 26 gauge. Like I say, it's about a 10-inch scrap. I'm not overly worried about this wire. I don't have to do anything terribly complicated. I'm going to find the centre of my finer wire, and I'm going to start winding everything together, or sewing it together as I like to think of it, right down at the bottom of the design. One of the reasons I like to do that is that sometimes, even though you generate the shape and it fits perfectly, once you start sewing everything together, it can creep round a bit and you will end up with a lopsided design. It's much easier to fix that, rather, whilst you're working from the centre at the bottom than it is to do it if you start at one end. So can you see, let me drop that down for a second. We have got curves on either side. So I've got a double curve just here, where you've got a loop inside a loop, and then it switches to the outside, inside, outside. That is the easiest place in this technique to attach our 2 sections together. So we've got a frame section and we've got the fancy curly whirly section. So if I just hold that in position, and it looks reasonably centralised to me, I'm going to find halfway along my finer gauge wire and just post half of that wire through that central gap. I'm just going to hold the left hand side out of the way for the moment. If you are left dominant, simply invert what I'm doing. It makes no odds which way you move at all. So I'm going to pinch everything firmly, just taking a second to assess whether these 2 sides equal. And because I've got the right hand strand of that finer gauge wire is down through the centre, I'm then going to draw it all the way around and just tie around the inner swooping section of my fancy frame to the frame, push that all the way through. So what I've done is I have wrapped one time around the inside of the fancy frame and the basic frame. And what I'm going to do now is bring the wire up between the fancy frame and the basic frame, so that I'm wrapping one time around just the frame itself. Push that down through the centre again and draw it back out. Now if you wish to, you can create very, very tight little stitches, as it were, by taking the end of the wire up through the loop where the double section is on the outside. You don't need to do that. You can if you want to, but you don't need to. So what I'm going to do is exactly the same as where we started. I'm drawing the tail of the wire up and round the outside, and I'm going to now tie the inside of the double loop again to the frame, moving my grip along, pushing that leading edge of that tail of finer gauge wire down through the centre all the way around, and then I'm going to draw it up again between the fancy frame and the basic frame, so to wrap just around the frame itself. And then we move on to the next segment where there's that double loop on the inside of the design, wrapping that curved section of the double loop to the frame, And then again, one time around just the frame itself. If I switch that in the light, you should see the light catch on it. Push the leading edge down and through. Now to finish off on this side, I'm going to bring the tail of wire up inside this circular form. Draw that very, very gently through. And I'm just going to pull that around. For now, I'm going to wrap one time around the frame. I will finish by wrapping about 5 or 6 times around the frame, but I'll only do that when I'm certain that I've managed to centralise this fancy bit of framework. Now, to keep my life easier, I flip the design over. What this means is that the wire is now coming up from underneath. We need to get that around just the frame wire because our last wrap took the fancy frame to the frame. So between each fancy frame tie, we do one just around the basic frame itself, and then you'll see here that it's a little bit gappy. There's a gap between the basic frame and the fancy frame, so I just need to very, very gently push that until it sits exactly where I want it to. It will once I bring the wire up inside that little double curled part. If I pull that taut over the top, down through the centre and back out, it pulls it against the frame anyway. So the next stitch, as it were, I like to think of them as stitches, goes just around the frame itself. And you can see that this actually builds up really quickly. So one stitch around the frame and the fancy frame, one around just the frame, one around the fancy frame and the frame, then one around just the frame. And then the last stitch comes up inside that loop at the end. You can see where that wire is arriving. Pull that nice and taut, and then wrap one time around the loop to the frame and then one time around the frame. And at this juncture we can just check to see that the distance between our last stitch and the angle change up at that 12 o'clock is the same on both sides. Once I'm happy with that, what I'm going to do is run 5 times around just the frame, or if you prefer you can go all the way to the top, depends how much spare wire you've got. I will do 5 rotations on one side, 5 rotations on the other side, see what it looks like. If I'm happy with it, I'll trim it away. If not, I'll go the number of times around that frame that the shortest length of wire will allow, and then I'll do the same number on the other side and trim away the excess. So I've taken a couple of minutes just to finish off winding some wire around those shoulders. I had enough for about 20 rotations on either side, and there's just a small amount of wire up towards the upright bends, which doesn't have any wire in it at all. It doesn't really bother me at all. If it did, I would have used a longer piece of wire. So let's head back down to the board and I'll show you how you can set your drilled slab or your extra large bead into this design. So to add my drilled slab or your bead, whatever you're working with, onto or into the frame, I have a scrap now of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. This is around about 6 inches long, and I'm going to be utilising my round nose pliers and my bent chain nose pliers. What I'm going to do is to create a loop on one end. If I turn that around with those round nose pliers, I want that to come all the way around, so I've got a complete circuit of wire. Show you that in the centre there. And then I'm going to create a really sharp end. So it's almost like an eye pin at this stage. Now I want this to be really, really strong. So I'm just going to smooth and straighten the wire on one side, and then I'm going to take a look that I'm happy with the roundness and centralisation of that round shape. And I'm going to smush that quite firmly with my pliers, like so. And I'm going to open it up just like it's a jump ring. So I'm going to grip the half on the open side, and I'm just going to pull that upwards. Whoops. So it's now got that opening available to it. And what we're going to do is find the central point down at the bottom of my design. Well, as it happens, the central point is just here. So what I need to do is attach the loop through that central point, which is fiddly but not difficult. So we're going to pop that around the frame. If you find that the very central point at the bottom of your frame is doubled up through here, you may need to make a slightly larger loop. My loop, as it happens, is plenty large enough. Once I've got that set around either the frame or the frame and the fancy frame, what we're going to do is close that up. And we probably, if you can get in there with your fine or tapered tip pliers, we're just going to give that again a little bit of a smush. So I'm pulling that away from the frame assembly and just making sure that that loop is nice and firmly into position. I'm then just going to sit that without the bead or the slab for a second to make sure that I'm happy with the centralisation. That looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to now apply the bead or the slab. You will have previously checked that this fits onto a 1mm gauge wire. Unlike me, I didn't check this one. So let's give that a straighten up and see if we can get that through on the drill hole. If it ever happens to you that your bead simply won't go onto the wire, do try and check it first. But what I tend to have is 1,000 beads to work with. I think it's just the very, very end of my wire isn't particularly straight. So I'm just going to grab another bead that will fit inside the design. I have plenty of them, including this really delightful little mookaite, which I know has got a huge drill aperture. Let's slide that down into position. So that fits really, really nicely. Crisis averted, not a problem at all. Might not be the bead I was planning on working with, but it just shows you that you do need to check your drill apertures to make sure they're going to work in your design first. And also it's another reason that when my videos come out to you, I leave any errors in, whether they're rookie errors or professional errors. I want you to see how to deal with situations like that. So I always have like a gajillion beads that I can be working with at any given time. So once you've got your bead in position, hopefully you will have checked it first, you can see that we've now got 3 wires coming upwards at the top. Now if that alarms you, that you've got 3 wires in a bale, don't be alarmed. It is very, very simple. What we're going to do is use some 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire directly from the reel. So I'm going to pop that down for a second, grab my 0.4mm wire, I can't find the end, that's always a win. I'm going to leave it attached on the reel, unspool a good foot or so of wire to work with, and I'm going to start by rotating around that core wire that comes up through the bead. Now that end section is mangled. Not only will it not coil tidily, but it will be slightly weakened, so I've just trimmed that just shy of 1 inch away. And I'm going to start rotating around that core wire to get a really good tight spiral going. You can be lazy and trim that last little bit off, or you can be thrifty and make sure that you use every last little bit. Just not the mangled bit that was weak. We don't want weakened wire in our design projects if we're going to sell them. So just rotate that around and then tighten that coil up. And then we're going to slide that down so it sits just beneath the shoulders of the design. I've made that ever so tight. There we go. Let's move that down all the way down to the bottom and just get that to sit. Now you could, if you wanted to, fill the entirety of the gap between the top of the bead and where the central core wire meets the shoulder wires. You can fill that completely if you want to. I'm not overly worried about it. I'm just going to allow it to sit like so. And then what we're going to do is decide what kind of a weave we want to do with these 3 wires. Let's just straighten that central core wire a second, and I'm just going to splay apart the left and right shoulders. It makes it much easier for my poor tired eyes to see which way I need to be bringing that flexible, finer gauge wire. Now the design of weaving I did on the sample piece is very, very simple. It's a rotation around the core wire and then one around the left and the core, and then it switches to one around the right and the core. So you can do basically any weave that you fancy. I'm going to show you a very, very simple way to work with 3 wires now. I'm just going to switch from one pair to the next pair, back to the first pair. So my finer gauge wire is originating from that central or core wire. It's coming underneath, and I'm going to wrap it all the way around the middle wire and the lower wire on your screen. I'm just going to tighten that up slightly without tightening it too much. Then I'm going to bring the tail up between the lowest and the middle wires, pulling that firmly, and then I'm going to wrap around the upper and the middle wires, bringing that wire all the way down to the bottom, and then wrapping around the middle and lower, scooching those wires tightly, bringing it up between the middle and lower, wrapping all the way over the top, all the way around. So from the front you will see it switches from group middle and lower to group middle and upper, but on the back it will look different, which is fine because we're going to make that to the inside in a moment. So wrapping around the upper two, then the lower two, and again this is a very mindful weave. Once you get into your rhythm, you can crack on a really fair pace with a design like this, making sure that you tighten up those wraps each time you make a manoeuvre. You can do really any wrapping design you fancy on the bale. It's whatever you think will go in with the rest of your design, whatever you find easy, whatever you find inspirational. Now you'll see that one of the shoulders is slightly dropped, so I'm just going to pull that up slightly, and then that will allow my bead that I wasn't planning to use, but there it is, it's there now. Just tighten that up slightly and continue on my merry way with the weave. And all I will have done at the end of a couple of, maybe about 1.5 inches worth of weaving, is I will have tied that all together with a very, very simple bale design. I feel like I'm always showing you completed bales, so I'm not going to show you the complete bale today. I'm just going to call a halt to that weaving just here. What I will do is grab a scrap of that 1mm or 18 gauge wire and just show you how to add a charm onto a spiral up on the top of the bale. So if you do about 1.5 inches of weaving along here, create a very, very simple bale. All I've done is wrapped those 2 wires around, and then the 3rd wire has come to the front and I've put a spiral in position. So I'm going to make another dangly bead to go on here. Very, very easy indeed. Just a way to make something look a little bit different to the norm. So I'm going to start by creating a double spiral close to the end of those round nose pliers. This again is 18 gauge or 1mm wire. Just creating a circular form to begin with, squishing it with my flat pliers, my bent chain nose pliers in this instance, until I've got a second circuit around the centre there. So around once, around twice. If I flip to hold in my non-dominant hand, I can then push that away to create what is essentially a fancy head pin or a little lollipop. Now let's see if I have a bead to hand. I do. Fabulous. This absolutely gorgeous, it's almost a peridot colourway. Doesn't really match my design, but it shows you what to do next, which is to create a loop exactly the same as we did down at the base of that large slab. I'm going to push the wire forwards and away from where that disc down at the bottom is. Use those round nose pliers again to rotate around to create a round form. But instead of doing our standard wrapped loop, we're going to create an open and closable loop exactly the same as we did here, just from the other direction. So in this instance, we make the loop and then trim away the excess. In that instance, we make the loop with the very end of the wire. Both things end up with the exact same end product, really. So again, I'm giving that a hearty squish. And then I will just open that exactly the same way, like a jump ring, so that you have that open and closable loop. Once we've got the spiral up at the top of our wrapped bale here, let me just lift that ever so slightly away from the design. I'm going to show you on this one, and then you can just slot that through the centre of your coil, and then you can close that little open and closable loop up like so. So I've put 2 on here now. That seems a little bit like overkill, but it shows you how to achieve the objective. It's completely optional, and it's just another reason for having some little spirals hanging around. Well, thanks very much for hanging out with me today. I hope you've enjoyed that. I know I love this design. I return to it time and time again over the last sort of 8 or so years. If you want to stop the bead or the slab from spinning, all you'll need to do is pop a bar across the back, and I did that in exactly the same way that I attached the bead itself to the frame. So it's just finding points at which it will look neat and tidy, and 2 open and closable loops. It's an absolute doddle piece of cake for you. You don't have to have the dingly dangly bit on the front if you don't want to, but I quite enjoy them. They're good fun sometimes. Have yourself a beautiful day. If you've liked the content, do please feel free to drop suggestions for new videos. Do subscribe to the channel. It all helps to support us. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.